Welcome back everybody, my name is Ben and this is UnchartedX. In this episode we're taking a deep dive into one of the more notorious mysteries of the ancient world, the granite quarry of Aswan, located in Upper Egypt. Today this site is most well known for what can still be found here, still attached to the bedrock in its trench, the mighty Unfinished Obelisk. Carved from a single solid piece of granite, if it were fully detached from the rocky outcrop, it is estimated to have weighed over 1,100 tons, and given both its mass and location, in an angled trench in the middle of a granite mountain, it represents a true logistical nightmare for the primitive capabilities of the ancient Egyptians, at least as we know them today. Despite this artifact being the main attraction of the quarry, there is in fact much more than a gigantic unfinished obelisk to be observed here. Quarries like this one are incredibly precious resources, in some ways even more important to deciphering the past than are finished monuments or artifacts. As with the signatures left in the stone, they can tell us much about the capabilities and processes used by the ancient peoples who worked here. The signatures found in the stone here at Aswan are at the root of a long-standing and ongoing mystery and debate. Just how were these so-called scoop marks formed into the hard granite? And just what do they mean for the technological capabilities of the ancient civilization that made them? Authoritative claims from the academic mainstream would have you believe that these scoop marks, which are found both on and around the obelisk as well as in many other areas, are the result of nothing more than the primitive bashing or scraping into the granite with Dollarite pounding stones. And any visitor to this site today, before being let outside to look for themselves, is first forced to endure indoctrination in a stuffy room to this very end. A simple examination of these claims, however, will reveal that not only have they never even come close to being proven, but the idea itself has been rather thoroughly debunked. In the last couple of years, I've had the chance to visit the quarry a few times, and with the help of fellow researchers and the aid of some new technology that I'm not sure has ever been used before on this site, I think we can make some new observations and uncover a few more clues about the nature of the work that took place here in the distant past, and perhaps helped to better our understanding of this enduring enigma. I hope you'll join me as we explore the mystery that is the ancient granite quarry of Aswan. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that this video is being brought to you by none other than John Anthony West's Magical Egypt series. If you've seen the other videos on my channel, you know that I don't generally do advertising or product integrations. I'm not here pimping for Raid Shadow Legends, VPN products, or earbuds. So on rare occasions like this, when I do partnerships, it's only ever something that I can personally get behind, and the work of John Anthony West is most certainly that. I'm sure most of you know who John was, a luminary and pioneer in this field. I'm sad I never had the chance to meet him before he wested, but one way I can connect to him is through his work. His Magical Egypt series of documentaries is a symbolist's tour of ancient Egypt and one of my absolute favourites. It was discussed on the Joe Rogan Experience, and Graham Hancock called it the best documentary series on the mysteries of Egypt. I'm working with the producers of the series to bring you a special offer, and it's a great way to not only get access to this material, but to also help out my channel. If you visit unchartedx.magicalegypt.com, you can purchase or stream John's work, including the original Magical Egypt series, as well as Series 2 and 3, along with lectures, interviews, and a ton of other content. If you use the coupon code UnchartedX at checkout, it's set up for 10% off. You can opt for physical media with the DVDs, you can buy a streaming license to watch it directly, or even a monthly subscription to watch the content at whatever pace suits you. So, if you're interested in checking out this offer, go to unchartedx.magicalegypt.com for details, and remember to use the coupon code UnchartedX at checkout for 10% off. Now, back to the quarry. Much has been said about the Aswan Quarry over the centuries, and by many people. It's something that I've mentioned myself in previous videos. I spent a fair bit of time digging into it in my quarrying and logistics episode of the Evidence for Ancient High Technology. Since then, however, having visited the site a couple more times, and in particular after making several LIDAR scans at the site, I feel like it's time to take a deep dive into this topic. The famous Rose Granite Quarry with the Unfinished Obelisk is located around 1.2 kilometres to the east from the current path of the Nile, in the southern part of the modern city of Aswan. This is but one of many granite quarries in the Aswan region that produced much of not only the rose-coloured stone, but also the red and black granite that is used on many ancient Egyptian sites. If you've ever had the chance to cruise around the Nile here on a felucca ride, you'll notice that the granite bedrock is just everywhere. Even nearby Elephantine Island, which is home to some astonishing single-piece granite artifacts, like this box, was used as a quarry in ancient times. We don't have a lot of historical information about when or who first worked the quarry. One of the earliest known quarry masters was named Hori, who administered the site during the reign of King Ramses III around 1180 BC, which was deep into the New Kingdom period. Going by the Orthodox timelines, we know that the quarry was in use for at least some 1,500 years before this, as granite from Aswan can be found in many of the early dynasty Old Kingdom monuments and sites. Examples include the single-piece box found underneath Mastaba 17 at Maidum, supposedly the very first box of this type that comes from, and again this is according to the mainstream dating, the 3rd dynasty of the Old Kingdom. The well-known 4th dynasty is chock-a-block full of Aswanian granite, to the tune of tens of thousands of tons of it, if not more. The massive Valley Temple at Giza with its 70-ton blocks.
No, we can go in. We'll go in the other side. I don't know if this is probably blocked off here, but look at the size of this guy on the left here.
And I've been waiting to see... Oh my god! And I was waiting to see that one. Bang.
Oh, there's tons of that. There's a lot of the around the corner stuff.
Yep, this is how they kept the brontosauruses out that they used to build it.
The hundreds of huge granite casing stones of the middle and 3rd pyramids all originated in Aswan. Not just at Giza either, but from Abu Rawash in the north all the way down to Maidum in the south can be found remnants, fragments, and some few still intact examples of what were hundreds of huge granite pillars, columns, blocks and slabs. They all make it abundantly clear that the quarries of Aswan were well in use from the very earliest times in Egypt. The quarry and the unfinished obelisk that form the modern tourist attraction today have changed considerably from what they were only 100 years ago. Reginald Engelbach was a British engineer and Egyptologist born in 1888. He worked with Flinders Petrie in Egypt for a time as his assistant, and later on was responsible for the initial excavation and the first detailed study of the obelisk in 1922. Prior to this time, as you can see from this image, only a small portion of the obelisk was visible. The rest of the quarry was entirely buried under rubble and sand. Engelbach cleared the debris from this area and went on to author a couple of books that are still considered seminal works when it comes to obelisks. 1922's The Aswan Obelisk, with some remarks of ancient engineering, and 1923's The Problem of the Obelisks, from a study of the unfinished obelisk at Aswan. It is from Engelbach's measurements that we still derive the dimensions and the estimated weight of the relic at 41.7 metres long, or 137 feet, and 1,168 metric tons. We'll revisit some of Engelbach's experiments and claims later on in this video, but anyone interested in reading his works, they can be found at the excellent archive.org website.
Unfinished obelisk at Aswan Quarry. Only 1,200 tons in granite. Would have been an interesting effort trying to lift it up out of its hole in the quarry here, move it up, move it down, past all this other bedrock granite all over the place, and somehow get it to the Nile, which was something like a mile distant. Pounding stones.
Even in recent decades, the quarry has changed considerably. There used to be a wall at the end of the obelisk and a staircase that led up directly to it, all of which have today been removed. Some people think that the obelisk was the last thing to be quarried here, but a look at our historical accounts show that that really isn't the case, and in fact it could be vastly ancient, with thousands of years of quarrying happening after it was carved. Engelbach reported that the obelisk had been buried in over 7 metres of debris and sand, and during his efforts to clear it found that it had many large granite blocks on top of it that were thrown down from above somewhere. Quoting from his book, The Aswan Obelisk, quote, "It is curious that, during all the years that this obelisk has been known, those who were interested in the ancient methods of quarrying have not taken the trouble to clear it. nearly every work in which it is mentioned dismisses it in a few sentences. Both Goring in his Egyptian obelisks and Baedeker give its length at 95 feet and the width at the butt as 11 feet 1.5 inches. How they arrived at the latter figure passes my understanding, as it was buried under a chip heap to a depth of 7 meters. During the removal of the chip heap, we found some hundreds of large granite blocks thrown from a quarry above onto the obelisk. These had to be cut into 2 and sometimes into 4 before our workmen could handle them." End quote. As I mentioned in the introduction, visiting the quarry in modern times begins with a mandatory indoctrination by way of watching a 15-minute DVD in a hotbox of a room.
It's the official indoctrination that you have to go through at the quarry. So you get the story straight as pounding stones, everybody.
Major quarries. The Egyptians used to cut granite, and they cut major obelisks.
This is something unique to the quarry, as no other location in Egypt, at least in my experience, requires this sort of thing. It almost makes sense in a weird sort of way, as without it, the whole Dollarite pounding stone thing would be so obviously ridiculous that you really need something official and authoritative like this in order to condition the average tourist's mind towards that explanation. Of course, anyone familiar with the long debate around this topic, or in particular any engineers, stoneworkers, or construction experts who understand what it is they're looking at, almost uniformly reject this official premise for how the work was done. I've personally experienced this, as on the several occasions I've visited the quarry, we've usually had qualified engineers or other experts with us, and it was also reported by Chris Dunn in his book, Lost Technologies of Ancient Egypt, as something not uncommonly experienced by the officials of the tourism department in Egypt. Quote, "Yet, in a discussion with an Egyptologist with the Department of Tourism in 2004, I was told that every time she accompanies engineers around the unfinished obelisk, they dismiss the official theory as unworkable and start discussing how it really could have been accomplished. This may be considered hearsay or worse, thought of as pandering, but it rings true to me, for I too have been in the company of engineers who are of the same mind, and engineers are not known for pandering, especially towards other engineers." End quote. Once you escape the indoctrination session, you're let loose on the bottom level of the granite quarry, and you can immediately begin to see the different markings of whatever tools were used here.
Welcome to the quarry. Here we will see the famous scoop marks, and we will also see 2 different other methods of extracting the stone. The most important one, which is the mysterious one, lift this kind of surface after they extract. It's similar to the surface around the large obelisk. There are other scoop marks. خليها معاك لحد ما يطلع فوق. جبتها منين دي؟
We're gonna extract some of our own with that.
We have a job to finish. Also, the other methods lift different surfaces, and we will explain when we get close. One of the most difficult things that you will see here in the site, of course, as Mahmoud, what is Mahmoud is over and what he showed in the video, that they believe that these tools were the tools that was used to crush by pounding, or to pound the stone, smash the granite, and they believe that this is what it is.
By way of a little context, and I'm not going to belabor this as I've definitely covered it in previous videos, granite stone is some hard stuff. There are lots of stone types that are far, far easier to work in and shape than granite. It's why the Greeks, the Romans, and for that matter most of the famous stone carvers and artists used material like marble for projects rather than things like granite. But if you want something that's going to be solid, remain impervious to knocks or hits from most other types of materials, or something that's going to last an awfully long time, then granite is a good choice. It's used today for working surfaces like kitchen counters, or as building material in public spaces that will stand up to almost any abuse. Personally, I have a granite mortar and pestle at home that gets a fair bit of use, and my biggest concern isn't breaking it so much as I'm worried about it breaking anything else that it touches, like my tiled countertops. The way we quarry granite in modern times reflects its material toughness, which can range from 5 to 7 on the Mohs scale of hardness. We typically use explosives or huge mobile saws with diamond-tipped blades and silica carbide cutting compounds to separate blocks from the stone of the mountain. These blocks are then transported to factories where they're cut into slabs using massive reciprocating or circular saws that grind through the stone with a constant stream of liquid to keep down the dust and lubricate the saw, which is an important point that we'll circle back to later. At the Aswan Quarry, there are multiple quarrying signatures that we can find in different places. To me, it seems pretty clear that there were multiple periods of work here, and correspondingly multiple types of technology employed. There are the classic wedge and chisel marks, the dashed lines that show up after slabs of rock have been split by chiseling and inserting wedges of wood, which were then watered down, which made them expand and split the stone. This is a very common ancient method of quarrying. I've discussed it before, and it was in use during dynastic times when rulers like Ramses II used it in order to quarry granite from the Middle Pyramid complex, and it remained in use right down to relatively modern times. Even this dashed line here on the obelisk itself was very likely a medieval or even modern attempt at using this splitting technique to separate a slab from the obelisk, that thankfully was never completed. In another area there are some chisel marks, or at least that's what this looks like to me, as if steel tools were used to carve a section of the rock, and it's an area that I want to look at a bit more closely in future visits. By far the most obvious and the most discussed quarrying signature, though, are the so-called scoop marks, which are found all over the place here. The scoop marks aren't in a single area or really of a single type. You can find them on large open areas or slabs of bedrock like this area here, or even on top of the unfinished obelisk itself. The signature is on vertical walls where material has been removed, and at the bottom of narrow trenches, like those of the obelisk, or in the several mysterious so-called test pits that we'll take a closer look at later on. In a few places, the scoop marks even extend to the ceiling of undercuts, a real conundrum for the pounding stone hypothesis. These scoop marks were first discovered and commented on by Reginald Engelbach when he excavated the obelisk, and he wrote about them in his works. Quote, "The trench surrounding the obelisk, by means of which it was intended to separate it from the surrounding rock, is of most peculiar form, the effect being a series of parallel and equidistant vertical cuts, as if it had been made by a gigantic cheese scoop. Its width averages 75 centimeters, and its depth about 2/3 that necessary to extract an obelisk of square section. A feature of the surrounding trench is that there are no corners. Everything is rounded. Neither are there any traces of the marks of wedges, which are quite unmistakable. Besides, it is not practicable to use a wedge unless one has to remove a part from the side of the parent rock. There are no traces of chisel work in the trench at all, and not a trace of any copper implement was found during the clearance of the obelisk. We are therefore forced to the conclusion that the large balls of tough greenish-black stone, found in such profusion round the obelisk and all quarry work at Aswan, must have been the tools employed." End quote. So, let's establish the context and evidence around the orthodox explanation that it was pounding stones that made all of these scoop marks. It boils down to some very simple logic, as explained by Engelbach. They found Dollarite or diorite pounders here, so therefore that's what must have made these marks. It's exactly the same logic that leads us to the copper chisel conclusion. They found copper chisels from ancient Egypt, so that's what must have made all of the remarkable precision boxes, slabs, vases, etc. Because no other tools have been found, no other tools could have been used. Yet the obvious evidence for other tools is right in front of us. It's in the stonework itself. The signatures of large circular saws, tubular drills, and other forms of advanced machining have been explored in depth on this channel and by many other researchers, having first been brought to light more than a century ago by pioneers like Flinders Petrie. But in today's time, this evidence is generally ignored by mainstream academia. Although some attempts have been made, There's not been one single object ever recreated by experimentalists using solely the primitive methods, the copper drag saws, chisels, and pounding stones, that are supposedly responsible for the many thousands of incredible examples we can still view with our own eyes on ancient sites and in museums. Not one granite block has been cut, not one single-piece precision box made, not one wafer-thin or perfectly balanced vase carved, nor a single structure built in today's time using solely primitive means as a demonstration or proof of these methods. Of course, there is a lot of nuance in this discussion. Other people will claim that it has been demonstrated, but I don't agree. And I've explored this topic in more detail in the previous episodes in this series, looking at things like Chris Dunn's 4-step test for experimentalists. So if you're interested in this debate, I'd encourage you to check out those videos. I think there's one quote from Chris Dunn's Lost Technologies of Ancient Egypt sums up the situation nicely. Quote, "In all experimentalists' efforts to convince the public that their theories are correct, not one has provided convincing evidence that what they have accomplished explains all of the evidence. There seems to be a tremendous effort not to disturb the status quo when it comes to the stories such scholars tell about ancient Egypt. As long as experimentalists can scratch out a few cubic centimeters of stone using primitive tools, the ancient Egyptians are kept in their place in the history books." End quote. My point here is that the scoop marks and pounding stone hypothesis are part of this same discussion. Several experiments have been made to try and demonstrate that this was the method used, and all without success. Mark Lehner and stonemason Roger Hopkins, who I've featured in several other videos, made an attempt as part of the Nova Obelisk documentary series.
I've done it for 25 years in the field, and believe me, I've done it dry, I've done it wet, and the wet is much better. As you can see here, we achieved this in just a few days.
Quoting Chris Dunn once again. Quote, "Roger Hopkins is tasked with carving out an obelisk using the tools that Egyptologists maintain the ancient Egyptians used. For quarrying, they theorize that Dollarite pounders, Dollarite is a very hard greenish rock, were wielded by hand and bashed against the granite. These balls are 5 to 12 inches in diameter and weigh an average of 12 pounds. As Hopkins works away at his task, Mark Lehner demonstrates how he believes the ancient Egyptians worked the granite in the tight confines of a deep trench that is only 26 inches wide at its widest point. As his workers scrape the bottom of the trench with their Dollarite pounders, they respectfully avoid removing any of the granite. Hopkins has been at the task for 7 days when Lehner approaches him to view his progress. Lehner is not impressed, to say the least, for Hopkins had made very little headway, but proposed that he speed things up using more modern techniques. This is not the first time Hopkins has been involved with Lehner and has had to call in modern tools when running into difficulty with supposedly ancient methods. Nova's This Old Pyramid documentary had similarly run into difficulties using ancient techniques in the creation of a small pyramid. Lehner and Hopkins had to resort to steel tools and heavy machinery to lift most of the blocks that went into it." End quote. I do want to reiterate that I think experiments like this are a good thing, provided they're done transparently and without preconceived conclusions in mind, which unfortunately isn't always the case. As mentioned in the earlier quote, as long as a few cubic centimeters of material are removed, that seems to be enough to declare victory, which sums up the efforts of a lot of the so-called debunkers I've seen on the internet. This particular task, bashing or scraping on granite with 12-pound stone balls, is one of the more grueling things that you can attempt to prove your point. Many people who visit the Aswan Quarry like to give this a go, but it's a very short-lived burst of activity and it gets uncomfortable very quickly. Certainly, this was the experience reported by Mark Lehner and his crew, again quoting Chris Dunn. Quote, "While at Hamada Rashwan's quarry, Nova producer Peter Tyson also tries his hand at quarrying with a Dollarite pounder." Quoting Tyson, "I got a nasty taste of their job, minus the cramped space and the pressure to succeed. Cupping a greenish-black Dollarite ball in my hands, I brought it down with a crack onto a block of granite. Over and over, I bounced it on the same spot, till I thought I'd scraped the skin off my palms. After 10 minutes, my wrists hurt from trying to guide the 12-pound rock in at an angle, the better to break the granite, and stabs of pain began shooting up my arms. Mark Lehner recalled that after once pounding for several hours, he could barely type on a computer. All I wanted to do was smash the keys, he said. I did it for only 20 minutes, and all I had to show for it was a baby's palmful of granite dust. And the granite surface looked no different than when I'd started. 3 babies' palms filled with granite dust after 1 hour of pounding would be somewhat dispiriting. End quote. This was something people supposedly did all day long, every day, in extremely tight, confined, and hot spaces for months and months on end. It's still hilarious to me that academics seem to think that this is something your average ancient Egyptian would have wanted to do as some sort of honourable activity for Pharaoh.
Life expectancy for the average Egyptian man was about 33 years, but working on the obelisks was a privileged position.
We don't think, though, that they were slaves and was something that you might take a pride in. This would be something you might want to do.
There's also the mechanics of the actual task to consider. It's not just a simple matter of smashing the stone ball down as hard as you can, which is what most tourists who attempt to do this do, at least a few times over. In order to do this for hours and not just jar yourself into insensibility, you need to let gravity do the work and release the stone just before it hits the granite and then catch it again. Chris Dunn noted that this can get dangerous, as the pounders aren't perfectly round and they can bounce off the granite in all sorts of different directions. That might be onto your toes or onto the toes of your neighbour if you're supposedly doing this inside a deep trench like this one, let alone inside one of the deep test pits.
When we look at something like this, and some of them go to 8 meters deep, there is no space to swallow your down. For anybody to be going down there and working in these test pits. Plus, some of the test pits have the scoop marks horizontally like this. So of course it's impossible. I was here, of course, with the engineer Christopher Dunn, and far away from what he believes, which we can talk about a bit when we are around the second unfinished obelisk. After a little conversation, I told him, okay, so what do you think of the pounder story and the scoop? He said it's a ridiculous, doesn't fit. My father always used to say about this, like, how you gonna swing your hammer down there, you know?
Electric toothbrush.
Of course, this is granite and like crushing it.
Another factor to consider is the dust. Pounding like this does remove granite, albeit very, very slowly, in the form of granite dust, which you can see kicking up here. You need to frequently stop and remove the powdery dust from the pounding surface, as unless you do, it acts as a cushion for the stone. Not to mention the probable lung disease and shortened life expectancy that comes from working in confined spaces generating a ton of granite dust. It would have been extremely uncomfortable and difficult work, and required constant stopping in order to remove the powder from the work area. Now, here's where I think the pounding stone theory really starts to fall apart. It's already improbable that there is enough room to vertically swing these balls in the trenches and test pits. But what about in the undercuts? These require a horizontal pounding motion, without the assistance of gravity. Not only that, but we can see the scoop marks extending onto the ceiling of the undercuts, and now you're flat out fighting gravity. How plausible do you think it is to pound granite in the up direction? Also, there's barely any room here for a decent stroke, so it's a short movement at best. Let's see that experiment done. As Chris Dunn said earlier, I think you would be respectfully avoiding removing any of the granite.
Sitting in one of the rock cut quarries where they've been undercutting a piece. Yeah, right? Some more scoop marks, less pounding stone marks, I think. There's something else going on. You try and do horizontal pounding here. Wouldn't recommend it.
Marks like
These are the marks.
no, but I mean I have my laser. Yeah, the machine.
You want to look for striation? No, this leaves it striation. The first cut here in granite was rough like this.
That is the same thing. So
This white color one here looks like it's how many other attempts. Or like some people try to.
Before we get into some new observation and talk about what the scoop marks really could be, let's take a look at some of the mainstream's evidence for this method. There have been at least 3 experiments that have attempted some rudimentary metrics around how fast this method removed the stone. Reginald Engelbach, in his early 20th century work at the quarry, was the first to do any real testing of this theory. Quoting from The Problem of the Obelisks, quote, "To return to the trench, it is interesting to speculate on the amount of time which was expended in making it. To ascertain this, I tried pounding for an hour by hand at various times on one of the quarters of a 2-foot task, and I found that I had reduced the level by about 5 millimeters average. With practice, I could perhaps have done more. Let us assume that the ancients could extract 8 millimeters per hour from a similar area." End quote. Engelbach also added some interesting details to his experiment in his other book on this topic, the Aswan Obelisk. Quote, "I noticed that, if I threw the pounder down and caught it on the rebound, the granite broke up at a much greater rate, but to do this as a regular thing would certainly result in an accident, as occasionally the pounder rebounds at very unexpected angles. I am certain that they were not used entirely by hand in the regular work of cutting out the trench, as the work would go very slowly indeed, and, which is more to the point, it would not have the same regular appearance that it has." End quote. The regular appearance that Engelbach mentions of the scoop marks is something we'll come around to. As noted by Christopher Dunn in his exhaustive study of this topic in his book, there are several issues with this claim from Engelbach. Firstly, he tried pounding for an hour at, quote, "various times," end quote, which likely means he rested in between efforts and it wasn't a continuous hour of work. We also don't have any real description or measurement of the granite patch he worked on, whether it was an even 5 millimeters across the whole patch or just in the center. The nature of pounding a round ball into the floor of a trench would mean that you remove less material right up against the wall, as shown by Dunn in his book. We have only Engelbach's word here that he removed 5 millimeters of granite. Strangely, he then just randomly attributes the ancient Egyptians with a 60% greater capability to remove stone with this method, and he sets their figure at 8 millimeters per hour. In modern times, similar tests have also been conducted, notably by Mark Lehner and Roger Hopkins during their efforts with the NOVA documentary team, and also by experimentalist Dennis Stocks, although he was attempting to use pounding stones to flatten and dress a surface, rather than just dig down. But both activities involve the same thing, slamming a Dollarite pounder into granite, so the rate at which material is removed should be roughly the same. Chris Dunn extrapolated each of these into a removal rate that was applied to a 12-inch square of granite, and bear in mind that there are assumptions made here, as all he had to go on was the reported results from each researcher, which weren't exactly weighed out with precision. Engelbach's efforts in the early 20th century worked out to be an astonishing 464.51 cubic centimeters per hour removal rate. Mark Lehner and Roger Hopkins' work from several hours of testing came out to around 74.32 cubic centimeters per hour, and Dennis Stock's reported rate, which I believe he did actually measure out by volume of granite removed, was around 30 cubic centimeters per hour. Just to give you an idea of how much material 30 cubic centimeters is, it's about 2/5 the size of your average chicken egg, or around 3/4 the size of a golf ball. An hour of pounding to remove 3/4 the volume of a golf ball in granite. Take a look at this trench around the unfinished obelisk, and then imagine it filled to the brim with golf balls. Then add 25% to that number. That's how many hours of non-stop pounding it might have taken, just for the trenches, which, by the way, are only 2/3 as deep as they need to be in order to extract an obelisk with a square section here.
Here we are in the pit on the unfinished obelisk. Incredible work. I mean, you just can't fit people in here to be pounding on it and then sort of undermine it and use a horizontal pounding motion. It just doesn't make any sense. And I know Christopher Dunn's analysis of the scoop marks relative to the Dollarite pounders kind of goes a long way towards disproving that theory, but I always find it somewhat laughable that you have these depictions of loincloth wearing savages working on objects like this. It's insane. Look at it. I mean, you can't reach the top. I mean, this is just so much work. And I have no idea how they would have dug that thing up out of the quarry here and lifted it up, and let alone moved it anywhere. But there's also a couple of test pits on the other side.
It has to be in the hundreds of thousands of hours of work. Now, extrapolate that. Include all the other quarrying work involved in even getting down through the mountain to this solid piece. And now consider the literal hundreds of thousands of other granite blocks, slabs, boxes, obelisks, and other monumental architecture, all quarried by bashing Dollarite balls into granite bedrock. Does that really seem plausible to you? So, when it comes to the mainstream experiments that purport to demonstrate that this was the method used, clearly there are some discrepancies here. Chris Dunn subbed up the situation nicely in his work, quoting Chris Dunn. Quote, "In Stokes, Lehner's, and Engelbach's experiments, listed in the tables above, there is uncertainty, and the difference between Engelbach's and Stokes' result is even more pronounced. Engelbach's material removal rate is 15 times greater than that of Stokes. But then he ignored his own results and credited the ancient Egyptians with removing 63% more material than he had removed himself in the same period of time, which would make their efforts 25 times greater than those of Stokes. Suffice it to say that there is more than enough reported variation in the material removal rate of granite by researchers that the whole idea of this method being used to quarry obelisks is fragile and subject to serious questioning." End quote. Now, some of you might say, but what about fire? Didn't they speed up this quarrying process by burning? Well, yes, there is some evidence that fire was used in areas of the quarry, but also remember that there were lots of different granite quarrying techniques used here. The idea is, though, that you burn a fire on the granite for long enough to weaken its structure, then rapidly cool it, and bash on it to remove the stone. I'd actually like to see this tested and compared to the hourly removal rate for just pounding. I have my doubts that it would end up being any faster. Let's consider you have to first gather up the materials to burn, then spend however long it takes, which is probably quite a while, to heat up the granite to the point where it might actually degrade. Then you have to clean up the mess from the fire and the subsequent cooling with water, which would just make mud with all of the ash, before you can even begin removing the stone. I also don't think you're degrading much granite at all with each burn, a couple of millimeters at best. We're talking about bedrock here, not just granite pebbles. Either way, it remains an open question, and it begs some further investigation. There is also a mystery surrounding the Dollarite pounders themselves. These are river-worn rocks. They're not shaped by anyone, so they must have been brought in to the site from afar. There were many hundreds of these things found at the quarry, but were they really used for pounding into the granite? That's long been the assumption, but there's a bit more to it than that. Here's a passage from Reginald Engelbach, 100 years ago in 1922. Quote, "In very many cases the pounder had been broken by the great force of the blows delivered with it. I cannot believe that a man, using one of these by hand, could break it, as the only way I succeeded in doing so was by hurling one down from a height of about 30 feet onto a pile of others, and then only after repeated attempts. It has long been known that the face of the granite was dressed by means of these pounders, but I have not heard of their use being suggested for excavating a trench in it." End quote. Most of the stones he found were split in half or broken, which isn't something you notice when you visit the quarry today. They only display the intact examples. As Engelbach reported, you can't break these simply by the pounding motion. He had to repeatedly hurl stones down from some 10 meters up in order to split one.
This is how they made them, apparently.
Watch out, you'll break it.
So, what could have caused so many of these stones to break? Another hypothesis that's been proposed is that these stones were not pounders but used rather as ball bearings, placed beneath monumental pieces of stone in their pits once they were broken from the bedrock, in order to shift the stone around to achieve leverage to lift it up or even just to move it. I could imagine how that type of use would easily break Dollarite balls when there is a 1,000-ton lump of granite being levered around on top of it. And this explanation fits much better than most of them somehow breaking from repeated use by manual pounding. Engelbach said something else interesting in that passage, that it has long been known granite was dressed by means of the pounders, but not that you can dig trenches with them. By dressing, he means pounding into a roughly flat surface, basically knocking down all the high spots of stone, the ridges, in order to get it all more or less to a common level. So let's use some logic here and think through the process of excavating a trench with this method. And this is where we can start to approach the topic of the scoop marks with more of an open mind. Take a look at this 3D model of scoops that is taken from Aswan. We can cut this in half in order to look at the profile. They're characterized by the raised ridges on either side and a depression in the center. Bear in mind that a lot of stone has already been removed from these examples above them, but let's say we wanted to start making a trench. We start pounding away at the granite in one spot to create our depression and our characteristic scoop mark. We do that in a line, so we've got a bunch of depressions into the granite. Then it's time for a shift change, or we go home for the night. But when work resumes, if you wanted to excavate down further, what would you do here? You would start hammering on the high spots, the ridges, in just the same way as the dressing technique. Smack the ridges down till the whole surface is level with the depression, and then just keep at it, creating more depressions, then more ridges to pound down, right? Seems to me this is how it would go. But consider, there is nothing in this process that requires you to keep creating scoop marks in exactly the same spot as you move down. The center of the depressions would move left or right almost at random as we dig down and pound flat the ridges from the last scoop. Once it's more or less flat, we just keep pounding in the ridge spot, or within our work area we find whatever part of the granite seems the weakest and we start creating a new depression there. My point here is, there's nothing in this manual pounding technique that requires you to keep scooping in the same spot as you move down through the granite. In fact, it seems less efficient to do it that way, considering how slow it would go overall. You're just better off finding the weakest area of granite within the work area, and knocking that down to a depression. Then you start attacking the ridges. But take a look at any of the vertical surfaces here that show the signature of scoop marks. They all go down in a straight line. We can trace the path of the scoop mark on the vertical walls of the quarry and in the trenches. The alignment of the scoop itself is in a straight line, as if the one spot was continually scooped out going down. In fact, there is a small vertical ridge left on the wall that defines each separate scoop mark. It's how we can see the clear progression down through the stone. There are also horizontal striations on these walls, if you look closely, that run across each vertical channel, almost as if whatever made these marks was moved around or reset. Consider these signatures in the walls and trenches for a moment. It makes absolutely no sense for them to look like this for the manual pounding method. It's just not required nor efficient to keep the digging aligned in a straight line like this. You would continually pound out high spots as you created them, moving to the left or right of wherever you found weakness over the weeks and months it takes to dig down. Yet these straight vertical lines seem to insist that it was one single repeated pattern, in one single spot that was supposedly hammered on, exactly in a straight line, for all of those weeks and months. Somehow we also leave a vertical ridge and horizontal striations on the trench wall. Why? If you think about the process of excavating granite via pounding on it with stones, it just wouldn't look like this. None of these signatures make any sense in relation to the manual pounding stone hypothesis. Here's another strange characteristic. Let's consider the bottom of our trenches. We have a good example here with this 3D scan of what once was a completed trench and extraction. Here you can clearly see scoop marks to either side of a stone spine. These were once trenches, although the stone that made up the walls of the trenches has long since been removed, and there was once a large piece of stone extracted from here. You can see how it was undercut and the monumental stone piece was snapped off from the central spine, which is what's left. Why are there scoop marks at what would have been the bottom of these ancient trenches? If this were truly made by manual pounding, it would be a mostly flat surface at the bottom of the trench. Quarrying big pieces like this requires planning. You would know how deep you need to go before you start hammering in horizontally to undercut the piece that you're trying to remove. As mentioned by Engelbach, pounding stones are primarily a tool for dressing stone, for getting to a mostly flat surface. So we know you can roughly flatten granite with them. So why don't we see that here? At the bottom of a trench, the scoop itself is redundant. Anything below the ridges at the high points, the edges of the scoop, is digging deeper than you need to go. You're removing more material than you actually need to. something that is really hard to do when you're talking about hours in order to carve out the volume of half a golf ball worth of granite. So what is going on here? It seems clear the mainstream explanation of pounding stones really doesn't fit the evidence we have at hand, and it certainly hasn't been proven by experimentalists. If we were to throw off the dogmatic shackles of the orthodox perspective and do some speculating, we might come up with something that better fits the evidence. Chris Dunn did exactly that with his investigation into these granite signatures in his book, Lost Technologies of Ancient Egypt. Quoting Dunn, "A thorny question is now on the table. With Dollarite pounders making their way back to the scrap heap where they belong, what kind of tools did the ancient Egyptians use to quarry their obelisks? The horizontal striations are typical in cutting when the feed of a tool that is removing material pauses along its path, withdrawn to remove waste, and the interruption of the tool leaves a mark on the surface. Also, it could be that the tool was rocked back and forth against the walls of the trench to clear the waste on the vertical wall. Horizontal striations appeared where the tool pressed the cutting surface against the sidewall to keep the trench from narrowing. The tool marks on the trench are most certainly not precision machining. However, machining may provide a clue in explaining the features found on this mysterious ancient worksite. With this in mind, I provided a drawing to Don Reed, the supervisor of the tool room at Danville Metal Stamping, and asked him if he could machine some holes in a piece of aluminum, or any other suitable material. I provided him with a drawing of the hole placement and asked that the tool be a ball-end mill." End quote. Just look at the result of machining into the aluminum from Dunn's experiment. What do we see? We see vertical ridges and horizontal striations from where the tool was withdrawn or rocked to remove waste material, and then reset. Just like the signatures we see on the trench walls. It seems to show that whatever tool left these scoop marks, it progressed down through the granite in a straight line, and it left similar markings to a radial mill. The bottom of the aluminum block, however, with its radial impressions, really doesn't match what we can see at the bottom of trenches in the quarry, so it likely wasn't something exactly similar to a rotating ball-end mill, and Dunn says as much. Quote, "Figure 9.19 illustrates the results, but indicates that more than likely the ancient Egyptians did not use a tool that rotated horizontally. The ball-end mill certainly left radial impressions on the bottom of the cut as expected, but they are not the same as those at the bottom of the obelisk's channel. More than likely, the obelisk's channel was cut using a tool that functioned similar to a chainsaw, except it was much wider, as the intention was to remove as much material as possible in an efficient manner. An idea of what such a machine might look like is seen in figure 9.20. End quote. So, here Dunn gives us an approximation of what a machine capable of leaving these signatures might look like, at least using our own perspective on technology. Personally, I think that it may have appeared vastly different to this, but I think the point here is more about the mechanism or the method of the tool, described as something like a chainsaw but much wider. Think of something like a belt sander. Here's an example of something in action that uses this mechanism. But I don't think this would do much to granite, although it certainly seems effective against softer surfaces like roads and regular dirt. Another mechanism that I think is in the realms of possibility here is a tool using some form of ultrasonic technology. This type of mechanism has been demonstrated by jewelers like Jeffrey Appling, who I was made aware of thanks to Kyle and Russ from the Brothers of the Serpent podcast. Appling has demonstrated using small ultrasonic rigs to rapidly drill various shaped tooltips into hard material like granite, and it's a fascinating possibility that technology like this might be scaled up to an industrial form. If such a mechanism did in fact make these marks, then it would also have to have had a much more flexible tooltip in order to reach the undercuts that we know exist in areas like this one shown here. Dunn also recognized this and made the same point in his work. Quote, "However, there are indications that the machinery that ploughed out the material around the obelisk was more versatile than the one shown in figure 9.20 and could actually cut around corners. Figure 921 provides evidence of undercutting that was made near the obelisk. Needless to say, this image fully discharges the Dollarite ball theory and suggests either a more versatile machine than that depicted in figure 9.20 or another type of machine designed specifically for this kind of operation." End quote. While this explanation might sound implausible, given what we know of the primitive capabilities of the ancient Egyptians, An examination of the evidence seems to suggest that this is the most likely solution. There are two more aspects of these scoop marks that are worth considering here, with this alternative proposal in mind, and both of these are something that I've observed in recent trips. On our most recent visit to the quarry, in a couple of spots we noticed a characteristic of the vertical scoops on a couple of walls. They went from running straight down and then gradually moved to an angle running down the wall. This is a very common sign of an articulated tool that is working from a fixed spot. Consider something like a backhoe, a digging tool on an articulated arm. If you're digging straight out, it leaves a straight line, but as you go left or right from the pivot point, the angle of the digging changes. Eventually, you would move the whole arm and then start again. I can't really explain this angle change that we can see here in the quarry as a result of the pounding stone hypothesis, but it certainly fits something that's on an articulated arm moving from a fixed pivot point. We don't see these angle changes everywhere at the quarry, so it might be that there were multiple forms of this stone removal tool, some designed to run straight down, others that worked from a fixed pivot point. Another indication that there were various types of the same mechanism is shown by an analysis of the relative width of the scoop marks, something I was able to do by studying all of my LIDAR scans. They're not the same width all over the quarry, but what I did notice by doing some rough measurements on these scans was that within specific areas, the scoop marks are of a very similar width, suggesting that the same width of tool was used in one area and a different width tool used in another. Some of the variations we see might be down to the repeated withdrawing and levering of the tool as it worked, or even some overlapping of the mechanism in places as it was plunged into the stone. Not to mention thousands of years of erosion and weathering that's happened on the site. As Chris Dunn mentioned, this definitely wasn't a precision tool. Rather, it was meant to remove as much material as quickly as possible. Such a tool would not have been useful only in a quarry. So, can we find any indication of similar signatures in other places? Well, yes we can. There are clear scoop marks on a few of the granite casing blocks of the Menkaure pyramid at Giza, known as the Third Pyramid. These blocks are quite interesting, as while they were finished on most sides to fit into their courses and next to their neighbours, the outside faces remained rough as they came from the quarry, which was in the Aswan area.
It's not, I don't believe any story about liquefying or... No.
Because we saw
It's a tough tool, Mark. You see the scooping? That's a scooping mark. You can find it in Olanti Kamba. You can find it in Saxiwana. You can find it in the Unfinished Obelisk. Yeah, and here. For your terrible structure.
I've also seen similar scoop marks in places like Sacsayhuaman in Peru, on the great monumental limestone blocks of the Zigzag Wall. As well as in a few spots on the granite of the so-called Inca Roca walls found in Cusco. I've also seen an image from a site known as Torontoy, near Machu Picchu, and although I've not visited this site in person, this looks almost identical to the scoop marks that we see at Aswan. Scoop marks are also found everywhere on the Hananpacha, or the oldest sites in Peru, sites like Kenko and the Temple of the Moon. Although I've not visited it yet in person, talking with Hugh Newman of Megalithomania revealed that scoop marks also exist on the famous bluestone monoliths of Stonehenge.
I mean, one of the things I keep spotting everywhere, people talk about these like protrusions or nubs on, stones. They're like tuning things. To me, that they're part of this tuning aspect of it. They were probably much bigger originally. Then they would cut it down until it was tuned correctly. Likewise, you get scoop marks. You get scoop marks in Aswan. You get scoop marks in Peru, Machu Picchu, Ollantaytambo, all these other places. You actually get them at Stonehenge. There's two stones there, possibly three, that have got clear scoop marks, like ice cream scoops. Like butter. They've been taken, and some of them are huge. Some are this big. Taken out. I'll send you some images to add here. And they're almost identical. It's like the same technology. How
can we reconcile this evidence against the mainstream story of our history? It might seem implausible, and it's all admittedly speculation, which sometimes is the best you can do when peering this deeply back in time. But the concept of advanced tools and technology does fit the signatures left in the stone. And at the same time, the orthodox explanation is increasingly lacking in credibility the closer you look at it. As many of you are no doubt aware, I think that the current evidence favours the hypothesis that some advanced culture or civilization existed in this region, if not globally, long before the dynastic Egyptians, as we know them, ever arose. This isn't to say that the ancient Egyptians weren't connected to their distant ancestors. I think they were. And I think they speak to us of that connection when they talk about Zep Tepi, the time when the gods themselves walked the earth, or of the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, semi-divine beings with mystical powers. The dynastic Egyptians viewed themselves as a legacy civilization from these earlier times, and we even have records like the Turin Papyrus that details these ancestors going back more than 35,000 years before the first dynasty. Although today our academics dismiss these records as simply myth and legend. I think it's entirely possible that it was this civilization that was responsible for much of the megalithic and precision work we find around the world, along with the evidence for advanced machining. The same civilization that so many religions and cultural traditions from across the globe describe as being lost to flood, fire, or cataclysm. Events that we now know were a historical reality during periods like the Younger Dryas, which occurred only some 13,000 years ago. I think this possibility of a lost, ancient, high-capability civilization could and should have a profound impact on our society. One of these days, I'll do a video talking about why I think this picture of the past is so important, and what I think it means for us. But not today, as this video is already well and truly long enough. As always, I hope that we can work towards more open-minded research on these sites and a deeper investigation using all the tools and technology available to us, in the hope that we follow the evidence, no matter where it leads, or how many establishment paradigms it breaks. Thanks for watching. Well, there it is. I hope you enjoyed that deep dive into the Unfinished Obelisk and the scoop marks at the Aswan Quarry. I feel like I've been working on this video for quite a while. It's been several weeks of just non-stop working on it, but it's been in the works for a couple of years now. I kind of wanted to get back to the quarry to get more footage and also get some of those LIDAR scans that I have really to do the analysis and I think give this the attention that it deserves, although I still have a bunch of questions that I'm going to keep on looking at next chance I get to go to the quarry. I do want to say that I make those LIDAR scans and also scans from many other places like South America and other sites in Egypt available for channel members, for patrons, for people on Subscribestar if you're interested. And on that topic, I do want to say just a massive thank you to everybody who does support the channel in whatever way you're doing that. It's really the only way that I'm able to spend the time it takes to make and produce these videos. I do try to operate on something called the value for value model. It's a basic concept that goes along the lines of if you get some value from the work that I'm doing and you feel like returning a bit of that value to me, which is always appreciated and pretty much the only way I'm able to keep making these videos, you can do so. There's lots of ways to do that. They're all outlined on my website. It's unchartedx.com/support. A couple of quick updates on some topics here, and I also want to thank some specific people, the producers for this episode. But in terms of upcoming travels and tours, if you're interested in getting to Egypt, we will definitely be visiting the quarry again on this trip. It's happening from October, I think, the 12th to the 26th this year. If you're interested in that or you want to find out some more details, there's still a few spaces available. You can find all of that on my website. It's unchartedx.com/tour, or just follow the link at the top of the page. I'll also be doing a couple of trips this year with Randall Carlson. So in June, from the 13th to the 19th, I'm going to be in Montana with Randall, as well as the Snake Bros and the Cosmographia crew and Grow America. We're going to be tracing the path of the mega floods in Montana back up to places like Glacial Lake Missoula. I'm very much looking forward to this trip. It's going to be a great experience to be up there with Randall, having him teach us all about that. I'll also be in the channeled Scablands with Randall. We've done this trip last year. They're tremendous fun. It's a tremendous learning experience if you're at all interested in the Ice Age mega floods or in meeting Randall Carlson. We're doing 2 trips in September, the 19th to the 24th, and then also September 26th to October 1st. Both the Montana trip and the channeled Scablands trips, you can find all of the details for those trips on the website contact@thecabin.com. I also wanted to let you all know that I have been spending a bit of time recently updating the merch store. I'm actually wearing one of the new bits of merch that I've put in the store recently. Lots of fun new designs, I think. Some really cool images that we've put on some t-shirts and different bits of apparel. So if you're interested in that, check it out. All of the links to the merch store are below in the description, also on my website. I also want to give out producer credits for this episode. These are real credits, just like they work in Hollywood. You can use them in your LinkedIn, use them anywhere. I'll happily vouch for you. I do this on 2 levels, the executive producers and associate executive producers. First of all, the execs, and this is for people that have supported me in the amounts of $200 or more. There are people I want to thank individually. Thomas Czerniewski came in with very generous support in March, I think, and he said, "Hey Ben, please keep up the great work in getting the word out about our true history. You're performing an invaluable service to all of humanity." Thank you, Thomas. Looking forward to meeting you on the Egypt tour in November, as am I, mate. And thank you for the support, and thank you for coming to Egypt. It's going to be a blast. I actually can't wait to get back there. So many thanks, Thomas. I greatly appreciate it. Daniel Dewey, Dan from Queensland, Dan QLD Australia, drops in on my Twitch streams all the time. I do stream on Twitch several times a week. It's a good time over there. We have a really good community. Dan's a huge supporter of the Twitch channel. He's dropped me a number of tips that have certainly qualified for the executive producership on this. He also has, I think he's gifted more than 75 subscriptions in the Twitch channel. So massive thanks, Dan, and look forward to chatting with you soon. I'll be streaming again here pretty shortly. Lee Simpkins came in with $200, and he said, "Uncharted podcasts are interesting. Well done. Thank you so much, Lee." Maybe this is somebody that came in from the audio podcast, which I do have. I do an audio podcast that you can find on Spotify and iTunes, on my website as well, if you're just looking for the MP3, or through any podcast app. Now for the associate executive producers, these are people that have supported me in amounts over $100. Starting with Allan Chanyi. I'm sorry, Alan, I'm probably butchering your name. I'm notorious for that. He said, do you think that all the alabaster could be from destroyed boxes? And I assume you're talking about the beneath the step pyramid. I think that's a possibility. There's certainly inside corners and machined pieces that there's a possibility that they could be from some destroyed artifacts like that. But more likely, I think it was probably lining in a lot of the passages. That it wasn't just boxes; they were also used for essentially casing a lot of the tunnels and the chambers that are down there beneath the step pyramid. Ken Stoltzfus came in with $100. He said, "Hey Ben, I've been watching your videos for a couple of years now and decided it's time to support your work. Really liked your new intro video. It's perfect for sharing with people who are new to the ideas you and Randall Carlson and others present. Thanks for what you do." Thank you, Ken, and again, apologies if I butchered the name. And then, of course, Chris Partney, CH Partney, another supporter through the Twitch page and the Twitch streams. Chris, mate, thanks so much again for the support. You've been on this list before, a long-time supporter of my work and of my streams, and I really do appreciate your support, mate, so thank you very much. Also, TOKs sent me in a check, a $150 check. That actually came in December last year. I do have a PO box, so if you're interested in sending me anything like that, or sending me books or correspondence at all in the mail, I'd love to receive it. I do have a PO box. The details are on my website. And thank you, TOKs. All right, guys, thanks very much. Thanks for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all in the next one. Cheers.